Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to perform a case analysis of a significant Supreme Court resolution from the Philippines. The case is the Roman Catholic Bishop of Malolos, Inc. versus the heirs of Mariano Marcos, with the case number GR number 225,971, decided on June 17, 2020. By the end of this video, you will be able to identify the key facts and background of the case, pinpoint the central legal issues, understand the Supreme Court's ruling and its reasoning, and recognize the legal principles that were applied. Our objectives are to analyze the facts, identify the issues, explain the Supreme Court's ruling, and understand the legal principles involved. Let's begin with the factual background of this case. Understanding the timeline is crucial. The story starts in 1972 with the enactment of Presidential Decree No. 27, also known as the Tenants' Emancipation Decree. This decree aimed to transfer land ownership to tenant farmers. Under this law, portions of a parcel of land owned by the Roman Catholic Bishop of Malolos, or RCBMI, were awarded to Mariano Marcos. These portions were covered by Certificates of Land Transfer, or CLTs, specifically CLTs 746, 749, and 0392296. In 1980, RCBMI sought to cancel this award. Their main argument was that the land was not devoted to rice production, which was a requirement under PD 27, but was instead used for social and humanitarian programs. So in 1980, RCBMI filed a petition to cancel the award, claiming the land was not for rice production. 2 years later, in 1982, the Ministry of Agrarian Reform, or MAR, granted RCBMI's petition. They canceled CLT number 0392296 because the lot was found to be vacant and uncultivated when PD 27 was issued. In 1982, the MAR canceled one of the CLTs, CLT 0392296, finding the land vacant and uncultivated. Marcos filed for reconsideration 3 years later, in 1985, but it was denied in 1986. The reason given was that the cancellation order had become final and executory, and Marcos was faulted for laches, meaning he delayed too long in asserting his rights. Marcos's 1985 motion for reconsideration was denied in 1986 due to finality and laches. Despite this cancellation, the heirs of Marcos allegedly refused to surrender possession of the property. This led to a new phase of the dispute. With the heirs of Marcos still in possession, RCBMI took further legal action to recover the property. In 1994, RCBMI filed a complaint for injunction and damages with the Provincial Agrarian Reform Adjudicator, or PARAD, in Malolos, Bulacan. The PARAD is a quasi-judicial body under the Department of Agrarian Reform, or DAR, that handles agrarian disputes. In 1995, the PARAD ruled in favor of RCBMI, ordering the heirs of Marcos to vacate the property and declaring any sale they made null and void. The heirs of Marcos appealed this decision to the Department of Agrarian Reform Adjudication Board, or DARAB, which is the appellate body for PARAD decisions. In 2001, the DARAB affirmed the PARAD's decision, again ordering the heirs of Marcos to vacate. The heirs of Marcos's motion for reconsideration was denied in 2002. They then appealed to the Court of Appeals, or CA, in 2003. In 2004, the Court of Appeals denied their petition, observing that it was the PARAD's duty to resolve actions justly and expeditiously. This CA decision became final and executory, with an entry of judgment issued on June 19, 2004. At this point, it seemed the legal battle was over, and RCBMI had won. However, the story doesn't end there. Despite the final judgment, the records of the case were not immediately sent back to the PARAD for execution. This delay prompted RCBMI to file an urgent motion to remand the records in 2004. It took over 3 years, until 2007, for the certification remanding the records to be issued. Once the records were back with the PARAD, RCBMI filed a motion for the issuance of a writ of execution in March 2008. They argued that the 1982 MAR order, which canceled the CLT, was final and executory, and the writ should be issued as a matter of right. In 2008, RCBMI filed a motion for the issuance of a writ of execution. Instead of issuing the writ, the PARAD ordered the heirs of Marcos to comment. The heirs of Marcos opposed the motion, claiming a supervening event made execution impossible or illegal. This supervening event was the placement of the subject property under the coverage of Republic Act No. 6657, the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law of 1988, or CARP. The PARAD took nearly 2 years to resolve this, finally granting RCBMI's motion in May 2010. The PARAD reiterated the rule that once a decision is final, its execution is a ministerial duty. In 2010, the PARAD granted the writ, stating that execution of a final decision is a ministerial duty. The heirs of Marcos filed for reconsideration, again citing the CARP coverage. They argued that since the DR order subsuming the property under CARP was still on appeal, the writ could not issue. In 2010, the PARAD granted the heirs of Marcos's motion for reconsideration, holding the execution in abeyance until the DAAR secretary decided on the CARP matter. This suspensive condition was resolved in May 2011 when the DAR secretary dismissed the heirs of Marcos's petition for CARP coverage. An ocular inspection found the property to be a fish pond, not suitable for agriculture, and thus exempt from CARP. In 2011, the DAR secretary ruled the property was a fish pond and exempt from CARP coverage. With no more supervening circumstance, RCBMI filed another motion to resolve. In February 2012, the PARAD finally denied the heirs of Marcos's motion for reconsideration and granted RCBMI's motion for a writ of execution. In 2012, the PARAD again granted RCBMI's motion for a writ of execution, emphasizing that litigation must end. The heirs of Marcos filed a second motion for reconsideration, which was denied, yet no writ of execution was issued. RCBMI had to file 3 more motions to resolve before the PARAD finally issued the writ on December 16, 2014. After more delays, the writ of execution was finally issued in December 2014. The issuance of the writ in 2014 did not end the dispute. The heirs of Marcos filed a motion to quash the writ of execution. Their argument was that the 5-year period to execute the 1982 mayor order had already lapsed, as required by the 1989 DARAB rules. RCBMI opposed this, claiming the delay was attributable to the heirs of Marcos themselves. In August 2015, the PARAD granted the motion to quash, ruling that due to the lapse of the 5-year period, I could only enforce the order through a new action. RCBMI filed a motion for partial reconsideration, arguing that the 5-year period should have been suspended by the heirs of Marcos's actions. This was denied. Aggrieved, RCBMI filed a petition for certiorari and mandamus under Rule 65 of the Rules of Court before the Court of Appeals in February 2016. A petition for certiorari is a special civil action used to correct errors of jurisdiction or grave abuse of discretion by a lower court or tribunal. However, the CA dismissed RCBMI's petition in April 2016. The reason? Non-exhaustion of administrative remedies. The CA ruled that RCBMI should have first appealed the PARAD's quashal of the writ to the DARAB as provided by the 1989 DARAB rules. Since an appeal was available, a petition for certiorari was not the proper remedy. The CA stated that an appeal to the DARAB was available, making the certiorari petition premature. RCBMI's motion for reconsideration of this dismissal was also denied by the CA in July 2016. This brings us to the present case, where RCBMI has appealed the CA's dismissal to the Supreme Court. Now let's identify the core legal issues that the Supreme Court had to resolve in this case. There are 2 main issues. First, did the Court of Appeals err in dismissing RCBMI's petition for certiorari and mandamus on the ground of non-exhaustion of administrative remedies? This question is about the proper procedure and the applicability of a fundamental legal doctrine. Second, and more fundamentally, did the PARAD act in excess of its jurisdiction or with grave abuse of discretion when it granted the heirs of Marcos's motion to quash the writ of execution? This second issue goes to the heart of the PARAD's power and the finality of judgments. Before we dive into the Supreme Court's ruling, it's important to understand the legal framework that governs agrarian disputes. The Supreme Court first established that the governing rules of procedure for this case were the 1989 DARAB rules, because RCBMI's complaint was filed in 1994. These rules are designed for liberal construction, meaning they are not meant to be applied strictly or technically. Their primary objective is to promote the just, expeditious, and inexpensive adjudication and settlement of agrarian disputes. The rules emphasize that agrarian cases are non-litigious and non-adversarial. The rules of court do not apply, and proceedings are summary in nature, meaning they are shortened and simplified. Crucially, the rules are flexible, allowing adjudicators to adopt appropriate measures not covered by the rules to deal with the peculiar circumstances of agrarian disputes. This principle of flexibility and the goal of speedy resolution are central to the Supreme Court's decision. Now, let's examine the Supreme Court's ruling on the first issue, non-exhaustion of administrative remedies. The Court found that the CA erred in dismissing RCBMI's petition on this ground. The doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies requires that a party must first appeal to the higher administrative body before resorting to the courts. This allows the agency to correct its own errors and provides a speedy relief. However, this doctrine is not absolute. It has several well-established exceptions. The Supreme Court cited a case, Samar II Electric Cooperative, Inc. versus Saludo Jr., which outlines these exceptions. The Court found that RCBMI's action fell within one of them. The relevant exception here is where there is unreasonable delay or official inaction that will irretrievably prejudice the complainant. The Court concluded that the peculiar length of time this case had lasted, 37 years since the 1982 Mar order, constituted unreasonable delay. This delay prejudiced RCBMI by suspending its enjoyment of a legal victory it had won decades ago. The Court also noted that appealing to the DARAB would be futile. The relief RCBMI sought, the issuance of a writ of execution, is a ministerial act, not a substantive issue that the DARAB is primarily clothed with authority to grant. Therefore, the Supreme Court ruled that RCBMI's resort to the CA via certiorari was proper, and the CA's dismissal was an error. Now for the second and decisive issue, whether the PARAD acted with grave abuse of discretion in quashing the writ of execution. The Supreme Court ruled that the PARAD did commit grave abuse of discretion. The Court referred to Rule 12 of the 1989 DARAB rules, which governs execution. Section 1 of this rule states that execution shall issue as a matter of course upon an order or decision that finally disposes of the action. Section 2 states that the order or decision shall be immediately executory, regardless of appeal, unless expressly provided otherwise. The CA decision upholding RCBMI's right to recover possession became final and executory on June 19, 2004. RCBMI sought execution on March 10, 2008, well within the 5-year period for execution by motion. The Court found that the PARAD, contrary to the immediacy of execution provided in the rules, failed to immediately issue the writ. Instead, it ordered the heirs of Marcos to comment, which prolonged the litigation. The Court emphasized that the stalling of execution was attributable to both the PARAD's inaction and the heirs of Marcos's serial oppositions. The long delay, with no knowable basis, was unexplained and unacceptable. The Court concluded that the PARAD's actions were a patent prolongation of a case that should have terminated long ago. This unjustified delay, which ultimately led to the lapse of the 5-year period, constituted grave abuse of discretion. Let's summarize the Supreme Court's ratio decidendi, or the reason for its decision. The Court's decision rests on 2 main pillars. First, the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies is not absolute. It has exceptions, one of which is unreasonable delay or official inaction that prejudices the complainant. The 37-year delay in this case clearly fell under this exception, making RCBMI's direct resort to the CA via certiorari proper. Second, the PARAD committed grave abuse of discretion by failing to immediately issue the writ of execution for a final and executory judgment. The PARAD's actions, including ordering comments and holding the writ in abeyance, caused an unjustified and unacceptable delay that led to the lapse of the 5-year period for execution by motion. The Court's decision is a strong affirmation of the principle that litigation must end, and that administrative agencies, especially those created to provide speedy relief, cannot be allowed to cause undue delay. Finally, let's identify the key legal principles applied in this case. Several important legal principles were at play. First, the principle of finality of judgments. Once a decision becomes final and executory, it is immutable and unalterable. Its execution becomes a ministerial duty. Second, the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies, along with its exceptions. This case highlights that the doctrine is a rule of convenience, not a rigid requirement, and will not be applied when it defeats its own purpose. Third, the principle of grave abuse of discretion. This occurs when a tribunal acts in a capricious, whimsical, or arbitrary manner in the exercise of its judgment, or when its act is patent and gross as to amount to an evasion of a positive duty or to a virtual refusal to perform a duty enjoined by law. Fourth, the principle of liberal construction of procedural rules. The 1989 DARAB rules are designed to promote justice and dispatch, not to be used as tools for technicalities and delay. And fifth, the principle of social justice in agrarian reform. The creation of the DARAB was meant to provide a speedy and inexpensive forum for agrarian disputes, reflecting the state's policy of social justice. The Supreme Court's decision in this case serves as a reminder that procedural rules are meant to facilitate justice, not to obstruct it, and that administrative agencies must act with dispatch in resolving disputes. To conclude, let's recap the Supreme Court's final disposition. The Supreme Court granted the petition for review on certiorari filed by RCBMI. It reversed the resolutions of the Court of Appeals that dismissed RCBMI's petition. The Court reinstated the PARAD's order dated February 17, 2012, which had granted RCBMI's motion for the issuance of a writ of execution. Finally, the PARAD was ordered to proceed with the execution with dispatch and to inform the Supreme Court within 5 days of the actions taken. This case is a powerful illustration of how the Supreme Court can intervene to prevent procedural technicalities and administrative inaction from defeating the ends of justice, especially in cases involving the finality of judgments and the state's policy of agrarian reform. Thank you for watching this case analysis. Let's quickly review the key takeaways from this case analysis. First, we saw a long and complex agrarian dispute that spanned decades, highlighting the challenges of land reform. Second, the case underscored the paramount importance of the finality of judgments. Once a decision is final, its execution is a ministerial duty that should not be unduly delayed. Third, we learned that the doctrine of exhaustion of administrative remedies is not absolute. Unreasonable delay by an administrative agency is a valid exception that allows direct recourse to the courts. And fourth, the Supreme Court will not tolerate grave abuse of discretion by tribunals, especially when it results in the arbitrary and capricious delay of justice. Understanding these principles is essential for navigating the legal system, particularly in areas like agrarian law, where social justice and procedural efficiency are critical. Before we conclude, let's consider a brief thought experiment to solidify our understanding. Imagine a similar case, but with one crucial difference. What if the PARAD had issued the writ of execution immediately after the CA decision became final in 2004, and the heirs of Marcos had filed their motion to quash only in 2015? In this scenario, the 5-year period for execution by motion would have clearly lapsed. The delay would be solely attributable to the heirs of Marcos, not the PARAD. Would the Supreme Court have ruled the same way? Likely not. The key factor in the actual case was the PARAD's own grave abuse of discretion in causing the delay. This highlights that the court's decision was not just about the lapse of the 5-year period, but about who was responsible for that lapse. It was the PARAD's unjustified delay that was the central issue. Thank you for joining this detailed analysis of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Malolos, Inc. versus the heirs of Mariano Marcos. We have successfully analyzed the facts, identified the issues, explained the Supreme Court's ruling, and understood the legal principles applied. This case serves as a vital precedent in Philippine jurisprudence, particularly in the areas of administrative law, agrarian reform, and the execution of judgments. I hope this analysis has been helpful. Goodbye.